Hello and welcome to episode 21 of React Native Radio. Today on our panel we have Peter Piekarczyk.
Hey everyone.
Kevin Old.
Hey everyone.
And I'm Nader Dabit. Our topic today is going to be a second show talking to the Microsoft team. We're going to be going into the tooling and things that we kind of talked about last time along the lines of React Native and Cordova, and kind of going further in depth about what they're working on and a few things that were kind of talked about during React Conf. So I'll go ahead and introduce everyone that's joining us. Today we have Ram Panesari from Microsoft.
Hey guys.
And Jonathan Carter.
Hello.
So we already had Ram on the last show. So Jonathan, would you like to introduce yourself first and kind of give us a quick overview of what you do at Microsoft and kind of how you got into React Native?
Sure. Yeah. So I've been at Microsoft for almost 9 years at this point and been largely working in the client space the whole time on various things, although I did a stint on a product called OData, which some people may be familiar with and is kind of spiritually similar to what GraphQL is trying to do, but not as cool as that. So the last few years have been very much in the JavaScript space. I worked on the F12 developer tools in Internet Explorer and Visual Studio. And the last couple of years have been in the kind of developer services area. And so really my passion for React Native started about really around the time that it came out, because I had already been a fan of React.js. And we had been working on this service called CodePush, which we'll talk about. And the opportunity that we were building it for Cordova lent itself very much to React Native as well. And so we kind of took that as an opportunity to kind of go heads deep into understanding the platform, engaging with the community, and it's been awesome so far.
Awesome. Ram, would you like to introduce yourself and kind of give us a quick overview of what you do there at Microsoft as well?
Oh, sure. So I'm a senior program manager. I work in the same team that Jonathan works on, and we pretty much build cross-platform mobile tools that will ensure that you are more productive when you're building your mobile applications. Our area of focus is basically JavaScript-based tooling. So we primarily focus on things like Apache Cordova and React Native pretty recently. Apart from that, I've actually also been working on a whole bunch of open source projects. I wrote things like the React a web worker-based implementation for React DOM. I'm also playing around with ideas like React Native plugins and things like that. So pretty much all things React Native and Cordova, I guess.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so I guess the first thing we can kind of go into is, I know you guys are working on a Visual Studio extension for React Native. How is that going? And is that something that's available for Visual Studio Code as well as the regular Visual Studio platform, or is it just for one of the two?
So the Visual Studio, the extension is a React Native extension that's only available for VS Code. It is not available for the Windows Visual Studio, the big IDE kind of a thing. We started, so the whole VS Code idea was that VS Code is a super lightweight editor. And a lot of people who are writing React Native applications, we noticed that most of them use editors. There are not many people who use like heavyweight IDEs. And that's the reason why we decided to target VS Code first. That said, there's no reason why it should not work on Visual Studio. It will not work on Visual Studio in the future. At the moment, it's VS Code only. The other good thing about VS Code is VS Code runs on Linux, Mac, and Windows. And a lot of React Native developers use Windows, Linux, and Mac. So that way, we are able to reach many more people. So that's pretty much the story of the VS Code extension for React Native. It is available for download. I'll send you the link. That'll be a part of the episode. But if you go to the Visual Studio Code marketplace today and search for React Native, you should be able to look at the React Native extension for VS Code, and you should be able to download it from there. Some of the features that the extension provides include things like autocomplete, syntax highlighting. So basically, you can do things like arrow functions. You can have syntax highlighting for JSX. You can have you can know what method name exists on things like app registry. So when you just start typing in app registry dot, you get a list of all the methods. So you have all of those support. Apart from that, most common tasks that you perform from the command line, for example, things like starting or stopping a packager, or deploying your application to your device, things like that. So most of them can now be done from within VS Code. So that way you don't have to like switch back and forth between two windows. But I think the most interesting feature that a lot of people said they like was the fact that you can now use the VS Code extension for debugging your React Native applications. So this is like a typical IDE experience where you write your code inside the editor, and then you put a breakpoint right there inside the editor, and then you can start a debugging session. And as you manipulate the device or the emulator, and as you like perform actions, you hit the breakpoint in the editor, you can continue editing it. And thanks to React Native's live reload, the whole live reload thing works. We are now ensuring that it also works with hot module replacement. And that way you'll have a much more seamless experience. So those are the salient features of the VS Code extension. We announced this extension at ReactConf, and we are getting a fair number of downloads, and a lot of people seem to be interested. I'd invite you guys to give it a try. And if the listeners have any questions, I typically hang out in the Reactive Flux channel, either in the editor's channel or in CodePush. So you should be able to ping me, and we should be able to help you with any issues that you have with the editor, with the extension. Sorry.
Awesome. Is there a way you can talk about some of the internals of, for instance, the hot module reloading? How are you guys doing that, and what tools, possibly open source tools, are you using to handle that?
Sure. So the hot module replacement is still actually pretty early, and we actually don't even have to do anything for the HMR. React Native packager listens to a specific URL. I think it's called /hot module or something like that. So React Native pretty much listens to that, and whenever a hot module replacement happens, it just gets it called. So there's nothing internals or nothing specific about it. It's pretty much what React Native uses. Now, if you do want to hear about internals, I could tell you about how do we do the real debugging, right? I mean, today the experience is you open up a React Native application on your phone, you shake the device, open up the menu, click on debug on Chrome, and then Chrome launches, right? So maybe I could get into the details of how that works with Visual Studio if you guys are interested.
Yeah, absolutely. I was mainly interested just if you guys were wrapping any of those React Native tools, but so certainly talk more about that.
Sure. So debugging is also pretty straightforward. So here's what we do. The moment you hit debug in Chrome on the device, what basically happens is there is a signal that's sent from the phone to the packager, telling the packager that I want to get started into debugging. The other thing that the phone does is the phone switches itself into what they call a proxy mode. Now, what a proxy mode basically does is instead of running all of your JavaScript logic on the phone itself, it basically lets the packager give you the run the JavaScript logic. I mean, technically, it's not the packager really, but it's Chrome. But what the packager does is it says, okay, now that you are in proxy mode, I will proxy all the results and run it to you. And the actual JavaScript starts getting executed in Chrome. And what basically happens in Chrome is it's just a bunch of JavaScript code that's like it's a bunch of JavaScript files that are loaded. And in Chrome, because it's Chrome, you can now continue using things like Chrome's debugger and profiler and all of those tools, and start putting things like breakpoints or watch variables and things like that. So that's how that's pretty much the nuts and bolts of how debugging works on React Native. I think I also wrote a blog post about it that has like a sequence diagram that shows what is the workflow and how does the control flow and things. And maybe I'll share a link at the end of the podcast which people can look at. So given that that's how it works, what we did is all we had to do in our case was we basically had to replace Chrome and add in VS Code there. So we needed to do two things. First is whenever the packager gets the command to launch Chrome, at the moment it hardcodes the fact that you need to launch Chrome. It basically says, open this file called Google Chrome, and then it gives its path and stuff. So we had to replace that. We have a pull request into the React Native repository where we said, hey, don't hardcode it. Instead, use an environment variable. But till that pull request is accepted, what we basically do is we monkey patch the module called OPN. That's the module that is responsible for like launching the real Chrome executable. So we monkey patch that and say, hey, don't launch Chrome. So that's step one. And step two, basically what happens is once the package is ready, it starts listening on a WebSocket port. And Chrome, whenever Chrome is open, Chrome sends a message to the WebSocket port saying, hey, I'm a debugger. I'm ready for all of this. So instead of Chrome doing it, what we do is we start up a node process, and the node process sends this information. And given that VS Code can already debug Node, it's pretty much like the workflow after that is pretty much similar to how you would use Chrome for debugging any JavaScript. So Chrome debugs JavaScript, and in our case, a node process is being debugged by VS Code. So that's pretty much the workflow there. Another thing that you guys might be interested is looks like this is pretty much how Nuclei, Facebook's IDE, also works for debugging. In fact, I spoke to those guys at ReactConf, and they're a wonderful bunch of people who have implemented pretty much the exact same story. And given that we are thinking about debugging, both us and them, we are thinking about making changes to the packager where we could have a story where the packager could become like a hub. It's like the central place to which multiple debuggers could attach. And say someone like, so instead of having to hard code and open up Chrome, maybe what we could do is it listens to a port, and then either VS Code or Nuclei or Sublime or any other editor could send in a message, say, hey, I'm a debugger, I want to start a debugging session. And that way you'll have like this remote debugging experience that you already kind of have with, say, Cordova or like a web-based scenario. So that's something that's that we spoke about, and looks like that is going to be the future. I don't know what the implementation dates and times are, but that might be how we'll be doing debugging in the future, and that way we'll have more editors support debugging React Native applications.
So you guys, I guess you guys introduced this at ReactConf. Can you kind of go into the reception there and kind of what kind of feedback you guys got from the people at the conference?
Sure. So in the first 24 hours, we had approximately 1,300 downloads. And after that, it hasn't grown as fast, obviously, because that was like the big launch, right? So downloads-wise, I think this is actually pretty phenomenal, given that the tool is still in preview or experimental stage. Contrast this to our Visual Studio Cordova extension, and that's also getting a similar download count. So given that Cordova is much more mature, I would say that these are pretty good numbers. The typical kind of feedback that we are getting is, so one of the biggest challenges that we have is the fact that VS Code uses TypeScript, and pretty much every other JavaScript framework has a type definition file. React, on the other hand, depends heavily on Flow, right? So the biggest challenge that we had is we needed to keep up the TypeScript type definitions for syntax completion so that it is at par with what Flow has. And that way you have exhaustive and 100% coverage for all methods and all objects and all classes. So that's one thing that we did hear from a lot of people. People did tell us that they want better typing, and we are working on all of that. The second thing that they said is they actually wanted device debugging. This is not really a VS Code extension problem. It's more like a React Native problem. I mean, today, if you want to get an iOS device and start debugging on an iOS device, it's kind of painful. You have to go to the device. You have to explicitly change the port. You actually even have to go to your source code and specify what the remote packager IP is, right? So it's a lot of hassle. And people often, looks like a lot of people don't debug on their emulators. A lot of people apparently debug on their phones. And they don't want to have to go through all of this. So they asked us if Microsoft could come out with a way in which we could fix this. A third and very interesting piece of feedback that I did hear is people wanted to debug Android and iOS together at the same time. Now, this is interesting because React Native has always been talking about learn once, write anywhere. Surprisingly, a lot of people are actually starting to share code between their Android and their iOS applications. And that's actually encouraging to see. And I don't know what the answer to debugging on both the devices together at the same time would mean. But that's another avenue that we're looking into.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm kind of curious too. This is kind of off the topic of what we were talking about, but it does kind of go into the actual conference itself. I know that you saw a lot of talk about React Native at the conference. I'm kind of curious your personal opinions, you and Jonathan, about how the, I guess, discussion about React Native went at the conference and kind of where you think it's kind of headed based on kind of some of the conversations you have there. And then after we get into that, we'll probably go on to CodePush and we'll talk about that.
Sure. Maybe I can speak up and then shut up, and I'll let Jonathan talk. So one of the things I did notice and I really liked is the fact that a lot of people have acknowledged the fact that React Native is fundamentally changing the way we are writing mobile applications. So that was very good. The other thing that I did hear is people are complaining about the fact that React Native is not stable and it's not performant enough. And there was very, very conscious effort to indicate to people that we will continue to work on stability, we will continue to work on performance. So that was actually pretty impressive. The other thing that I did like is, so one of the things that I did notice is the emphasis on React Native was much, much higher than for React. I don't know if that's because apps are the next cool thing, but that's actually good. And I personally like writing apps and the whole native look and feel and having a good user experience. A React Native app can give you that. And I was glad when almost everyone that I was talking to, 80% of them were mostly talking about React Native rather than just the web part of the world. So that's the other big trend that I noticed.
Yeah, I guess from my side, I would probably just echo one of the main points that Ram just mentioned. I think from talking to a lot of attendees at the conference, as well as listening to a lot of the sessions, there definitely was an emphasis and a desire on improved maturity and stability of the platform. And in building tools and the services that we've been working with and engaging with various developers, we've continued to kind of hear that as well, that, you know, the breaking changes that have happened between releases and the lack of still not complete parity between iOS and Android. And in some cases, some of the kind of core developer tooling is only really just coming online, like the run iOS command recently in the CLI. And so it's cool to see that there's an extreme amount of energy, but really the focus, at least for me at React Conf, was not to continue generating new shiny features, but really to kind of double down on, completing the promise, so to speak, that React Native has for a lot of people, and that has created that excitement. And that now that the number of people using it is growing, some of that stability and continued maturity needs to continue happening. But for me, the thing that I liked about React Conf and have always liked about the React.js community as a whole is just the diversity, like the fact that you have so many people from very different communities, like Elm or other folks. So it's not like an echo chamber of kind of the same people just agreeing on the things that they all enjoy. It's like this strong desire to kind of push the community and the industry further together, which for me is one of the more inspiring things about it.
Another thing that I wanted to definitely touch on just before I forget is someone was talking about these phrases. So basically, it looks like what people said is React Native is about DX and UX. React Native is about developer experiences, DX, and user experience, UX. And that seemed to be the biggest focus of the community.
So let's talk about CodePush. I know we use CodePush in our company. We've adopted it a few months ago, maybe about 2 months ago now, and we really, really like it. We're also looking at App Hub, and we haven't really decided what we're going to use in production, but we are having to make that choice fairly shortly because we're going to launch our app within the next month or two. And I'm just kind of curious, can you kind of go over a basic explanation of what CodePush does for people who don't know? But then after that, kind of what you guys have done over the last month or two since we talked to you last, and any decisions or anything you want to talk about, I guess, just relating to it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so the concept of CodePush and kind of its goal is pretty simple. It's really just trying to help mobile developers. It supports both Cordova and React Native that want to have a faster release agility with their applications. So being able to respond to bug fixes, UI tweaks, user feedback in a predictable and kind of controlled way. So kind of one of the traditional things that people talk about is the review time on the iOS App Store, which of course is non-deterministic, and so introduces a potentially non-ideal delay in getting updates out to your users. But beyond that kind of delay, which, on Android or the Google Play stores is much shorter, there's still just kind of the element of the application doesn't control its own update experience, and that in and of itself kind of can be a drag. So maybe you don't know if your users are updating to your latest release, and maybe you had a critical bug fix that, if they didn't get, you kind of know it's going to have an impact on their experience. And so that's kind of when we talk about CodePush, there is the benefit of like, hey, I want to just instantly release updates to my app and not have to wait for the review process of the App Store. But there's also the element of like, I want to be able to know and control how my app itself synchronizes updates as I release them. And so really what CodePush is it's a cloud service that has a command line tool that lets you release updates of Cordova and React Native apps, your JavaScript, images, CSS, HTML for Cordova. And then we have a client SDK for Cordova and React Native that then synchronizes the app with the server to pull down updates. So that way you get that kind of end-to-end, release from the command line to the service, and then pull down those updates from the SDK. But the SDK is pretty comprehensive. So it has an API that lets you effectively have as simple or as complex a update experience as you want. So if you kind of want to just have a one-liner, we have a method called sync that you can add to your app in the case of React Native, possibly in the component did mount handler of your root component. And you call sync, and what that does is then on the start of the app, it queries the code per service, seeing if the app has an update. If it does, silently downloads it, installs it, and then it'll effectively apply it on the next time that the app restarts. And so that kind of default behavior is kind of what we call the silent update, where the end user never realizes that there is an update process happening, because you never have synthetic restarts. You don't display a prompt notifying them that there is an update. And so that's kind of one option. But then there's various configurability where you can choose to show a dialog. You can, we have a stock one that you can show when there's an update. You can customize your own. You can have it such that the updates, if they're available, will install immediately. You can have it where they'll install on the next time that the app is resumed, as opposed to waiting for the restart. And there's a bunch of various other options that you can use to configure this. And so really that kind of flexible SDK plus, this lightweight command line tool and cloud service, we've really hoped to provide this super easy experience for adding that always up-to-date experience that many developers had kind of if they're coming from the web, but in their mobile app. That way, and kind of when we've talked to a lot of people, it gives you that feeling that you have a much tighter relationship and engagement with your end users, so that when you see something, an opportunity to address a bug or ship a new feature or tweak something that you really wanted to get out but you didn't get it in time when you released to the store, CodePush gives you the option to, if the business decision is there, to make that release, make those updates. If you want to update 50 times a day, you could do that. And so it's really kind of trying to be that simple solution for folks that really want that agility.
So when you guys came up with the idea for CodePush, I understand that you were kind of using this as like something for Cordova and PhoneGap before React Native kind of became a thing. Can you kind of talk about the differences, I guess, working with the two, or if there's any difference at all, and kind of someone that would want to also use it for a Cordova app, is it something that you can kind of learn once and use in both worlds, or is it kind of different for both platforms?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, really, as Ram mentioned earlier, our team had been working on and developing tooling and services for Cordova for quite a while. And so we initially started CodePush for Cordova, and it was kind of a natural thing for us to do. We already understood the platform very well. And then when we chose to also attach CodePush to React Native, it was surprisingly pretty simple. And the devil's always in the details, but it's kind of like once you've conceptually understood the concept of a native bridge that's trying to expose iOS and Android specific APIs and capabilities to JavaScript, even though Cordova is using a web view and on React Native, it's hosting JavaScript core. There's a lot of conceptual carryover. And so it wasn't terribly difficult for our team to kind of get up to speed. I would say that we struggled more with some of the kind of advanced capabilities. So like threading is a good example. But fortunately, in the React Native community, there are a pretty good amount of resources that go into the depths of the internals of React Native. And the team and the community is also super responsive. So we were able to kind of fill in those gaps as we went. As far as like a developer that is wanting to use CodePush and maybe is coming from Cordova or coming from React Native or maybe using them in parallel, we've actually tried to make the experience between the two extremely similar, and they only deviate in ways that is optimized for that platform. So for example, the client SDK that I was talking about before, on React Native, all of the APIs that you would call in your app are going to return promises, whereas on the Cordova side, they take callbacks, which at least at the time was kind of more the idiomatic API design that was consistent with other kind of core Cordova plugins. But if you look at the two, in fact, if you pulled up the docs, the API reference for the Cordova and the React Native plugins side by side, if you kind of squinted enough, they would look identical because they're really conceptually is not much of a difference between the two, at least kind of from the API surface. Like the internals of them work quite a bit differently for obvious reasons. But if a developer was working on a Cordova app in parallel with a React Native app or a subsequent project, I don't think they would have any trouble picking it up if they were already familiar with CodePush.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. And after using it myself and kind of working with the API and the command line and everything, it's a really, really nice experience. I guess I could kind of see how it would kind of work across platforms without there being a lot of differences because there's not a lot of React Native specific stuff going on. You're kind of just issuing these commands and things like that.
Yeah, it's kind of like the differences come more in some of the subtle details of like our recommendations. So for example, when we say, hey, what's a typical place for you to insert the code to synchronize your app with the CodePush server, in Cordova, the recommendation is put it in the device ready event handler, whereas in React Native, it's the component did mount handler. And so there's differences there, but they're still kind of conceptually the same. It's like the guidance is, find the place within your app that represents a good point for app start. And so it's just a matter of then translating that to the platform. And then in the configuration side, in Cordova, when you're adding CodePush to your app, you basically put your app ID as a preference into the config.xml file because that's kind of the natural obvious place to put that kind of information for a Cordova app. Whereas in React Native, there's not really an equivalent to like a platform agnostic config place, right? And so kind of now it's like, in fact, that's one area that I would love to see something happen with React Native over time is to have an equivalent to Cordova's config.xml, because right now it's like you have to kind of understand, and it's not just CodePush, it's many third-party modules. Oh, okay, if I'm on iOS, to configure this module, I have to go find the info.plist file and add a config option there. And then in the Android side, maybe it's putting something into a Gradle file, or maybe it's configuration being done in code in my main activity file. And I think over time, as the desire, like as Ram was saying before, even though I think React Native is very unapologetically maybe not trying to fully abstract away the mobile platforms. In fact, I could be wrong, but at ReactConf, I think there was a degree of people saying, to be a good mobile developer, you need to understand the native platforms. And so, the goal of totally abstracting away the details of Android and iOS maybe aren't there. But in the case of kind of configuration, where as you have tools like React Native Package Manager or other things that are trying to take away the details of how do you kind of install, link, and configure a custom React Native module, it would be nice over time if there was kind of a single place to do that. But right now there's not. So that's another difference with CodePush from Cordova.
So I see a lot of movement here in this this space, I guess, between you guys, and there's a few other people kind of heading this direction, if not exactly the way you're doing it, maybe similar way, or maybe they have a different thing going on, but they also have this incorporated into it, like Exponent. So I'm kind of thinking, what's your opinion on where, I guess, applications are headed as far as doing this sort of thing? Do you think this is going to be the mainstream way of doing it in the future, or is this kind of just something that is only going to maybe happen for certain use cases? I know whenever we have, a big change in our project, sometimes we'll have some Objective-C stuff or have some type of new bridge that we've, created. We end up having to bypass code push. We actually, are not able to update it this way. I'm just kind of curious what your entire take is on that whole ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, I can only really speak for myself, I guess, but I feel like after having spoken to a lot of people and seeing, blog posts and things about this concept of doing hot code pushes for a very long time, that the reason that there's so many options for doing this, not just in the React Native space, but also in the Cordova space, is because I think the problem is real and the desire to solve it is very strong. And when we kind of released Code Push, we weren't sure what the response would be. And, myself, I kind of thought, this concept of doing this out-of-band updates is not particularly new. And so maybe people just never really took to it because they found that they didn't need it. But what I've found is that there's a ton of people that want to do these out-of-band updates and have this ability to control their update experience. And they just haven't done it, maybe because the barrier of entry was higher than they were interested in taking at the time that they evaluated something else. Or, certainly a year ago or 2 years ago, there weren't really many options at all. And so it was kind of either do nothing or write your own solution. And many people chose to do the former. So I think that over time, this kind of concept will become very, very commonplace. And within our team, we kind of always use the example of like Ajax on the web. When it first became popular, it took a while before it really became mainstream because, there were a lot of people that still felt like they didn't really need it, kind of server driven, post back every time you click a button. Web experiences were largely sufficient for lots of things. But I think more and more, at least as I've spoken with developers, that this need to be ultra responsive to your end users is so critical to succeeding in the super competitive space of mobile apps that you need this option, even if you only use it once in a while. So for example, you mentioned there's still many scenarios where you can't use Code Push or App Hub or many of the other great options for doing this because you made a change to the native side of the app. And I don't know if that's necessarily a criticism against those out of band update solutions, more so than just saying as of right now, they're not capable of satisfying all situations, but over time that could change for some scenarios. But for the cases that they can solve, it gave you the ability to solve a business goal or engage with users in a way that you wouldn't have otherwise. And in fact, we have a lot of users that, kind of as we've been running Code Push now for about 4 months, not a ton of time, but we try to reach out to folks and really understand how they're using it. And I've been very surprised with the fact that there's tons of people that have been running in production and have never needed to update their binary in the store for months, that they were just updating over time just using Code Push. Now that's a little bit challenging, especially in React Native, because the platform releases a new version every 2 weeks. And so many people are very interested in updating and there's core bug fixes and new features. And so that kind of comes back to the stability with React Native. Right now there's a bit of churn such that, there are lots of people that are using Code Push where it's kind of like you get a couple of updates out with Code Push, but then you have to release a binary again because you wanted to update React Native. And so I think some of that churn will eventually slow down and there won't be a need to as version React Native in your app as frequently. At which point, we hope that these kind of over-the-air update services provide a lot of value for apps. And more, I've actually not personally spoken with anyone that said they had no interest in using a service like this. It was kind of more just a matter of when they would have time to set it up in their app because they agreed that it would add a lot of value to their workflow. It's kind of a nice companion to, if you've already got like a really good crash reporting and analytics solution to be able to watch and understand the health and engagement of your users, it's only natural that you have solutions to like actually respond to the data that you're seeing in an extremely quick way. And so I think it'll become more commonplace regardless, what service, whether it's Code Push or someone else, users end up using. And I think probably once, a few big influential brands start doing it, that'll then end up having a big shift in terms of people's perception of like, oh, wow, if so-and-so's doing it, then yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We should look into that too. So I would say in the next, 6 months to a year, I would expect it to be, really common with mobile dev.
So a couple of things about what you just said. Something I found interesting is now that we've implemented Code Push, we are like, whenever we implement a new feature, we're actively seeking a JavaScript SDK, whereas before we may have gone with the native SDK. So we're looking for the JavaScript SDK first because we know, we can kind of implement any updates through Code Push as opposed to the native side, as long as the performance isn't going to be, an issue. So I found that kind of interesting. And also what you were saying about having a larger company kind of back a project like this, the fact that you guys are actually backing this makes our CEO and us as developers a lot more confident in using it. And our experience with it has been like really, really, really good so far. So
cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's none that I can say publicly, but there's quite a few really influential companies that are using it, using Code Push internally, and are evaluating going into production that I would be super excited if they did, and I think would help foster the confidence that other developers might have in using something like this. So we definitely take it very seriously that because it's a kind of an elective type feature, like you don't have to do it. We try to find every way we can in the SDK and in the documentation to kind of reduce the amount of errors as possible so that people feel more confident. So like one example is the Code Push SDK. When it installs an update, it has a whole handful of heuristics that it uses to identify an update that has failed. And if that happens, it actually will roll the update back and report that issue to the server. That way you can feel confident that your end users will never be stuck with an app that just is constantly crashing every time they open it. And then from the CLI, you can see the metrics of the update and spot that one of them failed. And then you can roll that update back on the server so that no additional users will get it. And really the goal there is just, we want to make sure that people don't kind of look at this and say, wow, with this new agility, that's great, but maybe it makes it too easy to do the wrong thing. And we want to make sure that perception doesn't, get carried forward.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. It seems like this feature with being able to push code to the device is almost at the point where React was a couple of years ago, where people were doubting it because it seemed too good to be true. Mm-hmm. Do you find that that may be some of the perception? Do you have a lot of customers say, is it really that straightforward?
Yeah, we definitely do. I mean, I think I've had people say that exact thing so many times, either on Twitter or an email, like, hey, this looks awesome, but it's got to be too good to be true, or
right. What's the catch? Right.
What's the catch? And actually, some of my favorite moments, because we have a pretty I try to be as connected with all of the people using the service as we possibly can, including you guys, who I reached out for feedback on Twitter. And I actually have most of the apps that I know of that are using CodePush, and I run them all the time, see who's updating what, make sure everything's good. But there's been a few cases where we've had users who shipped an update. They maybe didn't test it as well as they should have, and it caused a crash. But there was that kind of response of running the app and seeing that the app crashed, but then when you restarted it, it had rolled back to the previous version. And that really created that perception, at least for folks that had that unfortunate situation of wow, this really did have my back, so to speak. And even though it might have enabled me to be a little more cavalier than I should have, it still made sure that everything was put into a good spot. And so now what I think we need to do is provide better guidance, because right now with CodePush, we have this concept of deployments where every app that you create has multiple versions of itself at any given time. And so you can release updates to a staging environment, test those, and then promote that exact same update into production. Very much the way that kind of multi-deployment swapping happens on the server side. And we have many, many people being very successful with this. And so they never have that situation where they're releasing directly to production and kind of, crossing their fingers, hoping it works. Unfortunately, the way that you would kind of create multi-environment builds in React Native is non-trivial. And this kind of goes back to my comment about there's a lot of things that React Native has not currently chosen to abstract away, and therefore, if you want to understand how to have configuration in your app that varies between a release build or a staging build or a dev build, you end up having to understand specifics of Xcode as well as Gradle and other things, which make the barrier of entry to doing that a little bit harder. And so what we're working on right now, that actually within the next day or two, is trying to distill some of that guidance into our documentation to make it easier for people that want to successfully implement a little bit more robust of a testing and release strategy using CodePush, which right now is a little bit difficult because of the nature of React Native. And so we just want to make sure to have as much of that content out there for people to use. So
awesome. Switching topics a little bit, do you guys have any reluctance with adoption simply because you don't currently have an SLA and it's currently free and the pricing is to be determined?
To be entirely honest, we haven't. I would say that maybe the Microsoft brand has helped with that, but we explicitly say on our website that, because of the fact that we're in beta and we don't have an SLA, that we're not outwardly recommending the use of the service in production. But when we talk to people more and more after they've evaluated the service and kind of tested it internally, the response that we keep getting is hey, we're going to go in production with this because regardless what you say, and the lack of an SLA, we feel very comfortable with the product and we need this as of yesterday, so we're going to just do it. That said, we kind of jokingly say with people, even though we don't have an SLA, our team has kind of a self-imposed commitment where, we're on Twitter all the time. We're super responsive on GitHub. I pretty much live in Discord on the React to Flux channel. Anybody, if you go into any of those places and look at Blast and Tangent, you'll see me chatting with folks. And so we're super motivated to help people out. And I think that has kind of resulted in the reluctance not really being there. I'm sure there are people that we haven't had a chance to talk with that maybe the lack of a firm pricing model or SLA has kind of scared them off, but I actually haven't seen it. And so, we're really we're working towards, getting to the point where the service is kind of quote unquote RTM, and we can have that official SLA and clarify, pricing for everybody. But right now we have not had any responses from people that have expressed kind of their reluctance or disinterest because of that.
Also, another thing, how does the team, the CodePush team, feel? Speak as much as you can, but kind of, you built a service around the developer agreement piece that Apple has. What if they take that away? Are there any specific feelings one way or the other about building a service around something that Apple could control out from under you?
Yeah. When we first built it, we definitely had this conversation a lot. And as you might imagine at Microsoft or any, company for that matter, there's a degree of, wanting to mitigate risk and how much effort do we put into something that might end up being totally deprecated because of something out of our control. I think the thing that really made us feel comfortable with taking that risk, so to speak, is that the developer agreement from Apple has only gotten more permissive over time, not less permissive. And what I mean by that is, for the longest time, they always made an exception for updating JavaScript code that was running within a web view, which is what allowed Cordova apps to do this concept of a hot code push. But then after React Native came out and everybody had the question of, well, wow, can you do this same kind of thing? The developer agreement is very specific to the web view, and so technically React Native is not a web view, but the JavaScript core is a system component of iOS. And so after Apple updated their developer agreement to then say the web view and JavaScript core, to me that really said, okay, they've had years and years and years to shut this down, because even though CodePush and AppHub and all these other really cool services are becoming more mainstream, there have been tons of apps that have been doing code pushes for years and taking advantage of that ability using a web view. In fact, we've talked to a ton of people that are now switching to CodePush from a homegrown solution that they no longer want to maintain. And so really, to me, I feel pretty confident that it's not going to become an issue. I think there are certain things that we've seen Apple have an opinion on. So like, for example, in our documentation, we recommend, if you're distributing an app through the App Store, do not configure your app to show the update prompt, because that is against Apple's policy. They're totally cool with updating assets out of band, but we've seen a few cases where they've rejected an app because of the fact that it prompted the user saying there's an update available. And so I think over the last few months, after having talked with thousands and thousands of developers who have submitted their app and had no issues, we've seen kind of very specifically what the parameters are, so to speak, that Apple is comfortable with. And I personally and my team don't have any concerns or feel like there's going to be anything that'll change anytime soon.
That's awesome to hear.
I mean, it could, right? I mean, who knows?
Certainly. But I think that's just a general question in the community, because things are so new. And I know that apps that I have prototyped, that's a general question about just the stability of the long-term effort, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think that's another, just to make one kind of quick last point. I think, for folks that may have that concern, it would absolutely be a goal, and is a goal for our team, to make the integration and usage of CodePush to be so simple and so kind of effortless that if Apple at some point chose to shut this down, it wouldn't really be a big inconvenience for you, because worst case scenario, your app is now no longer being updated. Because the way that CodePush works, if it couldn't reach the server, or you deleted your app from the server, or for some reason we had to, deactivate apps that were distributed to the App Store for policy reasons, the app would continue to function as normal. It just wouldn't get updates. And so, like I mentioned, even though I have no concern with any changes happening there, it's definitely a goal for our team to make the investment feel like it's small enough that it far outweighs any potential risks that you may be taking in adopting it.
And I have a question about what we're talking about right here. What do you guys think as far as Apple's motivation for allowing this sort of thing? Does this kind of make their job easier as far as not having to sit there and have as many apps coming through their pipeline that they have to look at and inspect and either reject or allow? Is this a good thing for them or a bad thing, or is it neither?
I mean, I think it has to be a good thing. Otherwise, they would have stopped it. I mean, I think, a lot of people maybe speak kind of a little disparagingly about the review process because it can be painful. But I mean, as a consumer, I think that Apple's attention to detail has definitely contributed very well to the store quality, even though there's always crappy apps. So I think their opinion and intention to detail is so strong that if allowing apps to update out of band without needing to be re-reviewed was hindering their desire to have a very high quality curated store, I believe they would have stopped it. And so I can't speak specifically to their motivation, but I just think that, they must have found that either based on the fact that many web developers were already very strongly used to having this kind of release agility, and therefore it strengthened the value of the App Store to make sure that developers coming from that background didn't feel kind of slighted or, now they were, being held back. And so that would be my kind of feelings, but I don't know exactly.
So we've kind of gone over CodePush for quite a while, and we're going to move on to the next subject. But before we do, I have, one last question there. What are, the future plans for CodePush? Do you guys have like a roadmap or any major things that you want to talk about over the next couple of minutes before we move on to the next topic?
Yeah, sure. We've been working on quite a few things, all of which are things we've been getting a ton of feedback on. So the one thing that we are currently working on and we're hoping to ship in the next couple days is the ability to release new updates to only a percentage of your end users, which is something we've been hearing a ton for a while and have kind of been just waiting to get to after some of the more core fundamental work. But we really feel like that feature works very well in the realm of like people that want to have that kind of agile release cycle, but even if they're testing their updates, they still kind of want to be a little bit conservative and flight them. And so we've seen a lot of cases where people want to say, hey, I'll release an update to 20% of my users, let that sit for a few hours or sit overnight. And if I don't see any crash reports or any issues, then I'll give it out to everyone. And so that kind of thing is, what we think is where the value of kind of this cloud hosted solution versus rolling your own starts to get a little bit more compelling, because it's like, hey, we want this to be a really strong kind of all-inclusive service for you being able to do smart deployments. Some of the other things that we're doing is, right now, as you mentioned, CodePush is only good for releasing JavaScript assets and images and those things. And so eventually you have to update the binary. And so right now we're working with, our sister team is the Hockey App team. And so they, have an existing service for releasing kind of beta and alpha versions of your app to your testers, getting feedback, crash reporting and everything. And so we're working on an integration with them so that folks that are using Hockey App and using CodePush will be able to then have like a more interesting and compelling experience because of that. So for example, if you're using Hockey App and you've already defined an app, or you've already created an account, or you've shared the app with another dev on the team, all of that configuration and management will then be replicated to CodePush. So you can kind of choose to manage your apps and your accounts in one place and almost have them be shared between both servers. But also things like if you want to release an update to just your QA team, or just to ROM, or just to 5 people, Hockey app has the capabilities to define groups and have users that it knows their UDID, and so you can target releases at. And so that's another example of like, we want to really improve the ability to do this concept of like smarter updates, where instead of just blasting it out to everyone, you can choose a segment of your users either by group, by identity, by percentage. You can imagine over time we do things like geographic distribution targeting, really to provide the flexibility for folks that want to, make those kind of business decisions based on either flighting a release, getting feedback from a specific person or group, or addressing a need that only exists for certain people. The other day that was highly requested, where basically you can choose to install an update when the app is next resumed, as long as it was in the background for a certain amount of time. And really the reason there is, people want to have a silent update experience, but still not delay the application of the update for the end user until the app is restarted, which in some cases can be days. And so we've just been trying to find those ways to improve the current client API to keep the update experience as non-intrusive for the end user as possible, while still trying to find clever ways to get the update in front of them sooner without having to wait, until they kill the app or the operating system kills it. So on all of our GitHub repos, we actually have a roadmap for a bunch of stuff we're working on. So if folks are interested, they can check out either the CLI or the React Native SDK GitHub repo and see other stuff that we're working on. So we try to be as transparent as possible, and we're always interested in hearing more feedback from people.
Very cool stuff that you guys are working on. So I guess to go to our next topic and kind of wrap up the entire conversation about what you guys are doing there, I kind of want to talk about the tools that you guys are building around creating React Native SDKs from existing iOS and Cordova SDKs. I know you have two separate projects you guys are working on. Can you kind of go into each of those and kind of give a quick overview of what they are, how you can go about learning more about them and using them, and what you guys are trying to solve with those?
Sure. So the main problem that we are trying to solve here is React Native is actually pretty new, and the plugin ecosystem in React Native is not very common. I mean, there are a lot of native SDKs out there, but there are not as many React Native plugins. And every time you have to go write a native module, you'll have to go through the process of having to write the JavaScript for it, having to set it up as a native module. And quite frankly, not everyone should have to do that. I love tools like RNPM that are trying to bring together an ecosystem there. And that's something that we are trying to help. Both the tools are pretty much experimental. One of them is more mature than the other. So one experiment that I'm working on, and which I also alluded to during the last conversation that we had on the radio, was a plugin that converts or lets you use any Cordova plugin as a React Native module. Basically, what it does is it works as if it's one single React Native module that you add to your system, and then you just do an npm install of any number of Cordova plugins, and each of those plugins will then be available as in your React Native JavaScript. The way it works is actually pretty simple. A Cordova plugin basically consists of two parts. One is all the native code that you write, and second is all the JavaScript that you write, which ensures that the native API is in a better consumable form. And then Cordova basically wraps this around and uses its plugin module system to dynamically load the API and make the JavaScript API available to the JavaScript of your application. What I basically did is I used a similar mechanism, but rather than using Cordova's plugin system, I wrote a plugin loader, if you may, that pretty much loads the Cordova plugin like Cordova, and instead of exposing it to Cordova, it exposes it to React Native. Now, the good thing about React Native is pretty much like Apache Cordova, React Native also requires two things in a native module. It requires all of your native code and all of your JavaScript, and that's exactly what the Cordova plugin provides. The project is called React Native Cordova Plugin Adapter. It's on GitHub, and it's actually usable right now. I'm currently doing the work to ensure that it works with React Native 0.22. And I'm also working to ensure that it works with Cordova plugins that are greater than version 6.0. By doing this, I'm hoping that a lot more native modules are available to React Native developers, and that way we are able to grow the ecosystem.
So I guess someone can create a React Native module using this plugin. Can they do it for iOS and Android, or is it one platform specific?
So right now it only works on Android. It can only be used in an Android React Native application. But the project is open source, and I'd love contributions for iOS. I'm mostly an Android engineer, and that's the reason why I wrote it on Android first. I'd love to have contributions that ensures that this project can work on iOS also. The reason why I started with Android first is I wanted to see what kind of usage it gets, and is it something that's really appealing to people. Clearly, there are people who are filing bugs. Clearly, there are people who have actually asked questions on the GitHub repo. So it looks like this is something that seems to be useful to people, and I'm guessing that it's probably time to write an iOS version too.
I think anything that can kind of bridge the gap between someone that has never really written a lot of native code and is trying to use React Native and they need something that's not there, any way to kind of make that process easier, I think is definitely going to be something that people will be interested in, and it sounds like that's exactly what you guys have built with that. So that's awesome.
Thanks. And I think you're right. I think you basically hit the nail on its head when you said that writing native modules is not simple. And a lot of React Native developers usually come from the web background, and getting them started on native is it's actually going to be taking time before you learn all the native stuff and go write native module. And that actually is a pretty good reason why we started that. So I think that pretty much hits the nail on the head. The second project that we're working on is a little more experimental. The idea there is you take any native SDK for a service like, say, Facebook or Parse or any native SDK, for example. You write a little bit of code that ensures that both the Android and the iOS native SDKs have a similar API. And then we take these API and try to generate a stub that's like a native module for React Native. And that way you don't have to go through the boring work of having to write a scaffolding or having to write all the scaffolding or having to write all of that boilerplate code. The stub is available. The good thing is you can actually go tweak the stub. So if you don't like the API that the stub generates, you can go play around with it and ensure that a better API is available, and then you can publish this as a React Native native module.
Awesome. I think both of those projects are really great, and I'm going to definitely be keeping an eye on them, and we'll be all probably taking a close look at those. Okay, great. Well, I think we're going to go ahead and jump into our picks. Peter, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. So the pick that I'm going with this week, and I'm going with it because I've been doing a lot of, like Ram mentioned, web component sharing with React Native, and something that's kind of helped me do that so far has been React Native Material Design, only because I've been using React Material Design on the web, and a lot of the APIs are very similar. So building stuff with React Native Material Design has been really cool and made my life super easy. But the one thing is, there's only Android support for it right now. But if you're developing Android apps, it's pretty awesome.
Great. Kevin, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I actually have two picks. One is on the just React side. It is Redux React Firebase. I'll have a link in the show notes. But it's a way to connect your Redux store to Firebase, which is pretty seamless, just as interacting with Firebase is. So, and then also on the React Native side, I think it's been picked before, but React Native Desktop has come across my dashboard again, and I'm starting to look into that. I know it's alpha, but it looks really intriguing, so wanted to mention that again. That's it.
Great. Rob?
I probably also have two picks. My first pick is RN Play, the React Native Playground. I'm not sure if it's really a new pick, because I'm sure almost everyone who's done React Native has seen React Native Playground. My pick is specific to some news that I heard where I heard that the React Native Playground folks might integrate with Code Push. I saw some chatter about it on the Discord channel, so that's my first pick. It'll be pretty cool to have like Code Push on the React Native Playground. My second pick is something that's also inspired by the React Native Playground folks. The idea is it's called a virtual device wall, and this is something that I've been using for testing my React Native applications. I'm not able. I can't afford like a whole bunch of Android and iOS devices, and I like the way in which Appetize and React Native Playground let you embed multiple devices on a web page. So I'm actually using that to see how my React Native app looks on multiple devices and multiple sizes with different orientations. It actually is definitely better than having to worry about a real physical device wall where I have to ensure that all my devices are plugged in and stuff. So it's like a virtual device wall, and that's my second pick.
Kevin, I think you may have one more pick, so I'm going to pause and let you jump in, and then after that, we're going to go to Jonathan and myself.
Yeah, so my third pick is a book called Sprint, which has just been released. The full title is Sprint, How to Solve Big Problems and Test New Ideas in Just 5 Days. I am a couple of chapters in, and this is one of the most inspiring books I listened to the books on Audible, but I'll say read. It's talking about how they prototype at Google Ventures. So I can't say enough good things about it so far, and I'm really excited to finish the book. So pick it up.
Great, Jonathan.
Yeah, I'm actually going to have to echo picks that were already mentioned, which I guess is a good sign. But yeah, React Native Playground is an awesome tool that I think many people probably already know about. But if you're used to kind of that JS Fiddle like easy prototype experience in the browser and want to be able to bring some of that same capabilities to React Native, React Native Playground is super important. And then like Ram mentioned, our team right now is currently working on integrating Code Push into it so that you can prototype an app using Code Push to see what that experience looks like in a super easy way. So I think that's really worth checking out. They're doing a lot more releases right now to respond to the updates to React Native. So those guys are obviously super engaged in the community and worth watching. And then the other thing is like Kevin mentioned, React Native Desktop, which has been super interesting to me lately. And I've been doing some app building and finding that really useful. I'm surprised that I haven't heard it be talked about more, but maybe that's just because I haven't heard people talking about it. But yeah, that definitely is another really exciting project that I'd love to see continue to get more mature and is absolutely worth consideration.
Okay, I have two picks today. The first pick is a book. It is actually Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. It's less of a book and more of like a bunch of essays or things that have been put together by him. It's really good if you like philosophy. My second pick is actually a blog post that I wrote, and it's titled From the Blues to Rock and Roll, Mississippi's Growing Technology Scene. And I'll put a link to it in the show notes. I'm from Mississippi, and we are currently at the very bottom of a lot of different things when it comes to our economy and our education. And there's a lot of good things going on as well. So I'm kind of trying to highlight those in the essay and also kind of go into some things that we can do to improve Mississippi. So I'd appreciate it if anyone wants to go and learn about Mississippi together and check it out. Okay. Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you, Ram, for coming on. As before, this was a really good episode, and I really look forward to having you guys on again in the future.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, that wraps up episode 21 of React Native Radio. We'll see everyone next week.